On the evening of March 12, 1983, in a cramped apartment on Schanhauser Allee in East Berlin, a 17-year-old girl named Petra Mannheim turned the dial on a forbidden radio and heard something that would destroy her life. The voice coming through the static was speaking in German, but it wasn't the German she knew. It wasn't the careful, measured language of state television or the rehearsed monotone of her teachers at the Polytechnic school. This voice had laughter in it. It had questions. It said things that made her heart beat faster and her hands shake as she pressed the small transistor radio closer to her ear, terrified that someone in the hallway might hear. "This is RIA's Berlin radio in the American sector, and you're listening to voices from the other side of the wall." She should have turned it off. She knew the rules. Everyone knew the rules. Listening to Western radio was Republikflucht in spirit, an attempt to flee the Republic without leaving your chair. Her father had told her about neighbors who disappeared for less. Her teacher, Frau Kohler, had spent an entire week explaining how Western propaganda poised the minds of socialist youth, how it made them weak and disloyal, how it turned children against their own families. But Petra didn't turn it off. She turned up the volume just slightly and listened. The German Democratic Republic in 1983 was a country built on silence. 41 years after its founding, East Germany had perfected the architecture of control. The Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, employed over 90,000 full-time officers and commanded a network of nearly 200,000 unofficial informants. In a nation of 16 million people, that meant 1 in every 50 adults was watching someone else, reporting, recording, remembering. But the numbers alone don't capture what it felt like to live there. It felt like walking through a city made of glass, where every wall had ears and every silence had meaning. It felt like learning to speak in code with your own family, because you never knew if your brother's new girlfriend worked for the Stasi, or if your coworker's sudden friendliness was the beginning of an investigation. It felt like living in a play where everyone had memorized their lines and the punishment for improvisation was erasure. The wall had been standing for 22 years. An entire generation had grown up with it as the natural border of their world to 155 kilometers of concrete, barbed wire, watchtowers, and mines encircling West Berlin like a scar around a wound. On the eastern side, they called it the anti-fascist protection rampart. On the western side, they called it a prison wall. Both were correct. Beyond the wall, beyond the death strip and the armed guards and the trained dogs, was a different Germany. A Germany with colors that seemed brighter in photographs, with music that moved differently, with words that meant what they said. The Federal Republic was everything the Democratic Republic claimed to hate: capitalist, decadent, individualistic, free. And it broadcast that freedom 24 hours a day on frequencies that concrete couldn't block. RIA's Berlin had been transmitting since 1946, when the Americans first set up their station in the rubble of post-war Berlin. By 1983, it reached deep into East German homes through transistor radios, shortwave sets, and occasionally through the large wooden receivers that families kept in their living rooms, relics from before the division. The GDR government jammed the signals when they could. They confiscated radios in random searches. They taught children to report their parents. But they couldn't stop the voices. Petra Mannheim had first heard RIA's by accident 3 months earlier. In December 1982, she'd been searching for a music station late at night, turning the dial slowly through the static, when a woman's voice had broken through, speaking about Christmas markets in West Berlin. The woman described lights strung between buildings, the smell of roasted almonds and mulled wine, the sound of church bells that rang freely, not on government schedule. Petra had listened for 7 minutes before fear made her shut it off, but she'd remembered the frequency. Petra lived with her mother, Anna, in a 4th-floor apartment in Prenzlauer Berg, one of East Berlin's older districts. The building had survived the war, which meant it had high ceilings and ornate molding, but also meant it had thin walls and unreliable heating. Their apartment consisted of 3 rooms, a kitchen with a table that wobbled, a living room with a brown sofa that her mother had reupholstered twice, and a bedroom they shared, divided by a curtain that Petra had sewn from old bedsheets when she turned 14. Her father had left when she was 9. Officially, he'd relocated to the West for work opportunities, which was the phrase the party used when someone escaped. Unofficially, he'd made it through Checkpoint Charlie with forged documents and a borrowed passport, and they'd never heard from him again. After he left, men in leather coats had come to their apartment twice. They'd asked Anna questions about who her husband had spoken to, what books he'd read, whether he'd ever expressed doubts about the socialist project. Anna had answered carefully. She'd cried at the right moments. She'd said she felt betrayed, that she hadn't known, that she remained loyal to the Republic. They'd believed her enough to leave her alone, but not enough to let her forget. She lost her job at the municipal library and was reassigned to a textile factory. Petra's acceptance to the elite polytechnic school was delayed by 2 years. Their names went into files that would never be closed. After that, Anna never spoke about politics. She never mentioned the West. She taught Petra to keep her eyes down, her voice quiet, and her thoughts to herself. "The wall protects us," she would say, repeating the official line. "We're safe here. We have work, food, housing. That's more than they have over there with their unemployment and their homelessness." Petra had believed her mother for years. Or perhaps she'd simply learned to act as if she believed, which in East Germany was the same thing. But something had changed during the winter of 1982. Petra had started to notice the gaps between what people said and what they meant. She'd started to see the way her teachers' smiles never reached their eyes, the way neighbors stopped talking when she entered the stairwell, the way her mother's hands trembled when she filled out the monthly self-criticism forms for the factory. She'd started to wonder what her father had seen that made him willing to risk death to leave. And when she'd heard that voice on Ria's Berlin, casual, confident, discussing ideas as if ideas were things you could simply have without permission, something had broken open inside her. She'd started listening regularly. Every night after her mother fell asleep, Petra would retrieve the small transistor radio from its hiding place behind the loose baseboard in their bedroom. It was a Stern radio model, manufactured in East Germany. But modified slightly, her father had shown her how to extend its range before he left, soldering in a longer antenna wire that she could drape along the window frame. She would wrap herself in a blanket, press the radio against her ear, and turn the dial to 94.3 FM. The programming varied. Sometimes it was music, Western pop that sounded strange and exciting, with electric guitars and drum machines that didn't exist in GDR youth clubs. Sometimes it was news, real news, not the scripted victories and production statistics that filled News Deutschland, but actual events with multiple perspectives and admitted uncertainties. There were discussions about the nuclear arms race, about the growing peace movement in West Germany, about the possibility of reunification that everyone in the East had been taught was impossible. But what Petra loved most were the call-in shows. People from West Berlin would phone the station and talk. They'd complain about politicians, argue about policies, share opinions about movies and books and ideas. They'd disagree with each other openly, sometimes rudely, without fear. The host would moderate, but he wouldn't punish. He wouldn't report anyone. He'd just let them talk. It was the most revolutionary thing Petra had ever heard. In East Germany, talking was dangerous. Real talking. The kind where you said what you actually thought only happened in whispers between people who trusted each other completely, and even then, you watched the doors. Public speech was performance. You praised the party. You criticized the West. You used the correct terminology. Working class, not poor. Peace-loving, not afraid. Democratic centralism, not dictatorship. But on Ria's, people just talked. One night in February 1983, a woman called in to discuss her daughter's education. She was frustrated because the school wanted to teach her 8-year-old about the Marshall Plan, and she disagreed with the curriculum's interpretation. The host asked her questions. Other callers joined the conversation. They debated. They cited sources. They changed their minds. No one was arrested. Petra had listened to that show 3 times, rewinding the tape she'd secretly recorded on her father's old cassette player. She'd memorized phrases, "I think the evidence suggests, ... double quotes from my perspective, ... I could be wrong." But ... double quotes, these were sentences you couldn't say in East Germany. There was no "I think," there was only what the party knew. There was no "my perspective," there was only the correct socialist viewpoint. And there was certainly no "I could be wrong." To admit uncertainty was to admit that the state's certainty might also be uncertain, and that path led to chaos. But Petra had started to think in these forbidden phrases. She'd started to have perspectives. And that's when she became dangerous. On the morning of March 12, 1983, Petra woke up with the radio still pressed against her ear. She'd fallen asleep listening to a program about literature, about books that weren't available in East Germany. Orwell, Solzhenitsyn, Kundera. The radio was silent now, the batteries dead, and weak sunlight was filtering through the thin curtain that divided the bedroom. Her mother was already up. Petra could hear her in the kitchen. The sound of plates being set on the wobbling table, the electric kettle beginning to hiss. She quickly returned the radio to its hiding place, smoothing the baseboard back into position. Her fingers moved automatically through the routine she'd practiced dozens of times. Hide the radio. Check for scratches on the floor that might indicate the board had been moved. Arrange her shoes in front of the baseboard in a pattern that would show if anyone had disturbed them. Her mother called her for breakfast. They ate in silence, as they did most mornings. Bread with margarine. Weak coffee. An apple that was slightly soft, left over from the winter storage. Anna read the newspaper, News Deutschland, the official party daily, while Petra stared at the grainy photograph on the front page. General Secretary Erich Honecker, meeting with a delegation from the Soviet Union, everyone smiling the same careful smile. "There's a factory meeting tonight," Anna said without looking up. "I'll be home late." Petra nodded. Factory meetings were frequent. They were where workers engaged in self-criticism, discussed production quotas, and listened to party secretaries explain why sacrifices were necessary for the socialist future. Anna hated them, but she never missed one. Attendance was recorded. "I have study group after school," Petra said. This was true, though she'd been thinking about skipping it. The study group was preparing for the Jugendweihe, the state's secular coming-of-age ceremony that would mark her transition to socialist adulthood. They were memorizing speeches about the superiority of the GDR, the dangers of Western imperialism, the sacred duty of defending the workers and peasant state. Petra had memorized the speeches. She could recite them perfectly. But lately the words felt like stones in her mouth. "Don't be late," her mother said. "Frau Kahler called yesterday. She said you've seemed distracted." Petra's stomach tightened. Frau Kahler was her teacher, but she was also a party member and a known Stasi informant. Everyone knew it, though no one ever said it aloud. She taught civics and German literature, which in East Germany meant she taught correct thinking. Her classroom had posters on every wall. Workers raising hammers, farmers holding wheat, soldiers guarding the border. The caption was always the same: everything for the good of the people. "I'm not distracted," Petra said. "I've just been tired." Anna looked at her then, really looked at her, and Petra saw something in her mother's eyes that made her chest ache. It was fear, but also something else. A kind of recognition. As if Anna knew exactly what kind of tired Petra meant. "Sleep more," Anna said quietly. "And be careful." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Be careful of what? Of whom? Careful not to think too much? Not to question? Not to become like her father, who'd chosen freedom over family and left them both behind to face the consequences? Petra wanted to ask. She wanted to tell her mother about the radio, about the voices, about the thoughts that were growing inside her like weeds through concrete. But she knew she couldn't. Because if her mother knew, she would have to choose between protecting her daughter and protecting herself. And Petra didn't want to force that choice, so she said, "I will." And they finished breakfast in silence. The Polytechnic School was a 15-minute walk from their apartment, through streets lined with gray buildings that all looked the same. East Berlin in 1983 wasn't ugly exactly. There were parks, fountains, monuments to fallen soldiers, but it was colorless. Everything was functional, efficient, collective. Individual expression was bourgeois. Beauty was suspect. Petra walked with her head down, her school bag heavy with textbooks that repeated the same ideas in different words. She passed the bakery where her mother bought their weekly bread ration. The state-run grocery where a line was already forming for the morning delivery. The pharmacy with its perpetually empty shelves except for aspirin and bandages. She passed checkpoints where Vopos, People's Police, stood watching the sidewalks with expressions of bored vigilance. She passed murals celebrating the heroic proletariat. She passed a group of pioneers, children in their blue neckerchiefs, marching in formation toward their school, singing a song about the party's wisdom. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be, and Petra felt like she was suffocating. At school, she sat through classes with the discipline of long practice. Mathematics, where the word problems always involved collective farms exceeding their quotas. Physics, where they studied Soviet achievements in space. History, where they learned about the Great Patriotic War and the inevitable victory of socialism over fascist capitalism. In German literature, Frau Kahler was discussing Bertolt Brecht. They were reading the life of Galileo, which was approved because Brecht had been a loyal communist who'd returned to East Germany after the war. Frau Kahler paced in front of the classroom, her heavy shoes clicking on the linoleum, her voice sharp. Brecht shows us how the individual must submit to the collective truth, she said. Galileo's tragedy is that he places his own observations above the wisdom of the church, which represents the social order. He disrupts unity. He causes chaos. Petra's hand moved without conscious thought. She raised it. Frau Kahler stopped pacing. Yes, Petra. But wasn't Galileo right? The words came out before Petra could stop them. The earth does revolve around the sun. He was right, and the church was wrong. The classroom went silent. 23 students held their breath. Frau Kahler's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Right and wrong are bourgeois concepts, Petra. What matters is whether an action serves the collective good. Galileo's truth caused instability. It undermined authority. It was therefore harmful. But it was still true, Petra said. And even as she said it, she knew she was making a mistake. Truth doesn't stop being true just because it's inconvenient. Truth, Frau Kahler said slowly, is what serves the people. Everything else is propaganda. She wrote Petra's name in her notebook, the small black notebook that every Stasi informant carried, and continued the lesson. Petra sat frozen in her chair, watching her teacher's hand move across the page, and understood with perfect clarity that she'd just marked herself for attention. The study group met after classes in a windowless room in the school's basement. 10 students sat in a circle, practicing the speeches they would give at their Jugendweihe ceremony in 2 months. The ritual would mark their 14th year and their formal acceptance into socialist society. They would pledge loyalty to the GDR, to the party, to the eternal friendship with the Soviet Union. They would promise to defend the Republic against all enemies, internal and external. Most of Petra's classmates treated it as a formality, a gateway to better jobs and university admissions. But a few took it seriously, like Thomas Becker, who sat across from Petra in the circle, his posture perfect, his speech passionate. I pledge to use all my strength to defend and strengthen our workers' and peasant state, Thomas recited, his voice ringing with conviction. I will work and struggle for a happy future for all people. Proceeding from the knowledge that socialist society is increasingly taking shape, I will always stand at the side of the Soviet Union and the other states of the socialist community. Everyone applauded. The group leader, a young teacher named Herr Schmidt, nodded approvingly. Excellent conviction, Thomas. You understand what it means to be a true socialist citizen. Thomas beamed. He was a model student, a leader in the Free German Youth, and Petra had recently learned an aspiring Stasi officer. His father worked in the ministry, and Thomas spoke about it proudly. "Someone has to protect us from enemies," he'd said once. "Someone has to watch," when it was Petra's turn. She recited her speech mechanically, hitting all the required phrases without feeling them. Her voice was steady, but her mind was far away. Replaying that morning's conversation with Frau Kahler, calculating the damage. Herr Schmidt frowned slightly when she finished. "Your words are correct, Petra, but I don't hear your heart in them. The Jugendweihe isn't just about memorization. It's about commitment. Do you truly understand what you're pledging?" "Yes," Petra said. "I understand." But she didn't. Not anymore. Because the more she listened to that forbidden radio, the more she read between the lines of what she was being taught, the less sense any of it made. How could she pledge eternal loyalty to a system that required eternal vigilance against its own citizens? How could she promise to defend borders that existed only to keep people in? How could she vow allegiance to a truth that made asking questions a crime? That evening, Petra came home to an empty apartment. Her mother was still at the factory meeting. The rooms felt hollow without Anna's presence. Too quiet. Too full of shadows. Petra turned on the lamp in the living room. The single bulb cast weak light that didn't reach the corners, and tried to do her homework. But she couldn't concentrate. Her mind kept returning to Frau Kleeler's notebook. To the way Thomas Becker had looked at her during the study group, his eyes assessing, calculating. She kept replaying her words about Galileo, about truth, and hearing how they must have sounded to ears trained to detect disloyalty. Stupid. It had been stupid and reckless. But she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Around 9 o'clock, she gave up on homework and went to the bedroom. She moved the baseboard, retrieved the radio, and turned it on. The batteries were new. She'd bought them from a black market dealer near Alexanderplatz, trading 3 months of saved meal tickets, and the signal came through clearly. "This is Ria's Berlin. It's 9 p.m., and you're listening to Open Lines, where we talk about whatever matters to you." The host was a man named Klaus Bauer. She'd learned his name from the broadcasts, learned that he'd grown up in East Berlin and escaped in 1961, just before the wall went up. He spoke with a slight Saxon accent that reminded her of her grandmother. His voice was warm, curious, unafraid. "Tonight we're discussing a question that came up earlier this week," Klaus said. "What does it mean to be loyal? Is loyalty to a government the same as loyalty to your values? Can you be a patriot while disagreeing with your country's policies?" Petra leaned forward, pressing the radio closer. A caller named Marguerite from Wedding said loyalty meant honesty, that real patriotism was fighting to make your country better, not pretending it was already perfect. A caller named Jürgen from Charlottenburg disagreed. He said loyalty meant stability, that constant criticism undermined national unity. They argued politely. Klaus mediated. No one told them what to think. Petra listened until midnight, until her eyes burned with exhaustion and her mind felt full to bursting. Then she rewound the tape she'd been recording, listening again to certain phrases, trying to understand how people could disagree without hating each other, how they could question without destroying. She was so absorbed that she didn't hear the apartment door open. She didn't hear her mother's footsteps in the hallway. She didn't realize Anna was standing in the bedroom doorway until her mother said, very quietly, "Petra, what are you doing?" Petra's hands froze on the radio. The voices continued speaking, clear and unmistakable in the silent room. "This is Ria's Berlin, broadcasting from the free sector." Anna crossed the room in 3 steps and turned off the radio. The silence that followed felt like suffocation. Anna's face was white. Her hand shook as she took the radio from Petra's grip. "How long?" she whispered. "How long have you been doing this?" "A few months," Petra said. Her voice sounded small. "A few." Anna sat down on the bed, still holding the radio, staring at it as if it were a bomb. "Do you have any idea what you've done? If anyone finds out, no one will find out. Petra, they know everything. Do you understand? Everything. If one of the neighbors heard, if someone saw you buying batteries, if Frau Kahler—" She stopped, breathing hard. Frau Kahler noticed something. She called again tonight. She wanted to know if there were any concerns at home, any unusual behaviors. The room tilted. Petra felt sick. What did you tell her? I told her you've been sad about your father. That sometimes you ask questions because you miss him, because you don't understand why he left. Anna's eyes were wet. I lied to protect you. I've been lying for 4 years to protect you. And now you're listening to Western radio in our apartment, recording it, carrying around evidence that could destroy us both. I'm sorry, Petra said, and meant it. But she also meant something else, something she couldn't quite articulate. I'm sorry, but I can't stop. I'm sorry, but I need to know. I'm sorry, but I'd rather risk punishment than live my whole life in this silence. Anna seemed to understand. She looked at her daughter for a long moment, and her expression shifted from fear to something deeper, a grief that had been there all along, hiding beneath the careful performance of loyalty. Your father used to listen too, she said finally. Before he left, he'd stay up late with his radio and I'd pretend not to notice. I thought if I ignored it, it would go away, but it didn't go away. It got stronger until it was all he could think about. The truth. Freedom. What we were missing. You knew? Of course I knew. Anna's laugh was bitter. I'm your mother. Did you think I was blind? But I couldn't stop him, and I can't stop you. I can only... Her voice broke. I can only watch you become what he became. Someone who can't pretend anymore. Someone who's already gone, even though you're still here. She handed the radio back to Petra. Hide it better, she said. And if they come for you, don't tell them about me. Promise me that. Whatever happens, don't tell them I knew. Mama, promise me. I promise. Anna stood up, smoothing her factory uniform, reassembling the careful mask she wore outside their apartment. I'm going to make tea. Come have some before bed. We'll pretend this didn't happen. She left the room. Petra sat alone in the darkness, holding the radio that had become both her liberation and her chain, and understood that she'd already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She was being watched. Frau Kahler was suspicious. Her mother was terrified. Every day she kept listening was another day closer to the inevitable knock on the door. But she also understood that she couldn't stop. Because silence, she'd discovered, was a kind of death. And even if the truth killed her, at least she'd die having heard it. She placed the radio back in its hiding spot, positioned the baseboard, arranged her shoes in their pattern. Then she joined her mother in the kitchen for tea and the careful performance of normalcy that would define the weeks to come. Neither of them mentioned the radio again. But in the government offices across the city, in rooms with locked doors and filing cabinets full of secrets, Petra Mannheim's name was being written in reports. Her behaviors were being documented. Her associations were being mapped. The machine had noticed her, and the machine was patient. 3 weeks passed. March turned cold again, a late winter storm bringing snow that turned gray within hours, mixing with the coal smoke and diesel exhaust that hung perpetually over East Berlin. Petra continued her routine with mechanical precision. School, study group, home. She smiled at the right moments. She recited the correct phrases. She kept her eyes down and her thoughts invisible. But every night she listened to the radio. She couldn't help herself. The voices had become necessary, like air or water. They were proof that another world existed, that somewhere beyond the wall and the watchtowers and the mines, people lived differently. They argued about things that mattered. They made choices. They said no without disappearing. She recorded everything on cassette tapes that she hid in different locations throughout the apartment behind books, inside the lining of her winter coat, in an empty tampon box under the bathroom sink. She labeled them innocuously: school notes, music practice, study materials. If anyone searched, they'd find them eventually, but she couldn't bear the thought of losing the voices entirely. On April 2nd, 1983, during a RIA's broadcast about the growing peace movement in West Germany, she heard something that made her stop breathing. We've received reports, Klaus Bauer said, his voice grave, that East German authorities have intensified their surveillance of citizens suspected of consuming Western media. According to sources in the Ministry for State Security, a new directive authorizes extended detention and interrogation for radio offenses, particularly among young people. If you're listening from the East, please be careful. Your curiosity shouldn't cost you your freedom. Petra sat very still, the radio trembling in her hands. They knew people were listening. Of course they knew. The signals reached across the border every night, invisible and unstoppable. But now they were hunting more aggressively. Now they were targeting the young, the students, the ones who'd grown up with the wall and might be wondering what lay beyond it. Now they were targeting people exactly like her. She should have stopped then. That would have been the rational choice, the survival choice. Turn off the radio, destroy the tapes, forget everything she'd heard and retreat into the safe numbness of obedience. But instead, she turned up the volume slightly and kept listening. Because she'd already decided, somewhere in the weeks since her mother had found her, that she would rather be caught than complicit. She would rather be punished for hearing the truth than rewarded for accepting lies. It was the most dangerous thought a person could have in East Germany. And it made her, finally, truly free. The Stasi came for her on April 8, 1983, at 4 in the morning. Petra woke to the sound of fists pounding on the apartment door. Heavy, methodical, the rhythm of authority that didn't need to be polite. Her mother was already up, standing frozen in the kitchen in her nightgown, her face white in the darkness. Open up. Ministry for State Security. Anna looked at Petra with an expression that contained everything they couldn't say. I love you. I'm sorry. Don't tell them about me. Survive this. Then she opened the door. 4 men entered. They wore civilian clothes, cheap suits, leather coats, but their postures were military. 2 stayed by the door, blocking the exit. 2 moved through the apartment with practiced efficiency, opening drawers, checking closets, running their hands along baseboards. The lead officer was in his 40s with a thin face and cold eyes. He looked at Anna with mild contempt, then at Petra with something worse, satisfaction, as if she'd confirmed a hypothesis he'd already proven. Petra Mannheim? Yes. Get dressed. You're coming with us for questioning. Questioning about what? Anna's voice shook. She's 17. She's a student. She hasn't done anything wrong. That will be determined. The officer didn't look at Anna. His attention remained fixed on Petra. You have 5 minutes. Don't try to hide anything. We'll find it regardless. Petra went to the bedroom on legs that felt disconnected from her body. She pulled on jeans, a sweater, her shoes. Behind her she could hear the men searching, methodically and thoroughly. Furniture being moved, books being opened and shaken. The sound of the baseboard in the bedroom being pried loose. They'd found the radio. One of the officers emerged holding it, along with 3 cassette tapes. He showed them to the lead officer, who nodded once and made a note in a small black notebook identical to the one Frau Kahler carried. Petra Mannheim, the officer said formally. You are detained under suspicion of engaging in hostile activities against the German Democratic Republic, specifically the consumption and distribution of enemy propaganda. You will accompany us to ministry offices for questioning. You have the right to remain silent, though such silence will be noted and interpreted accordingly. Anna made a sound like something breaking. Please, she's just a child. She doesn't understand. She understands perfectly. The officer's voice was flat. Don't you, Petra? Petra looked at him and made a choice. She could deny everything, claim the radio was her father's pretend ignorance. It might work. The Stasi were thorough, but they also had quotas, and sometimes they accepted convenient lies. Or she could tell the truth. Yes, she said. I understand. The officer smiled slightly, as if she'd just confirmed something else. Good. Let's go. They led her out of the apartment and down the stairs. It was still dark outside, the street empty except for a black Wartburg sedan idling at the curb. One of the officers opened the back door and guided her inside with a hand on her head, the way police did everywhere. In every country when transporting prisoners. As they pulled away, Petra looked back through the rear window. Her mother was standing in the apartment doorway in her nightgown, her hand pressed to her mouth, watching her daughter disappear into the machinery of the state. Petra wanted to wave, to give some sign of reassurance or farewell, but her hands were shaking too badly. The last thing she saw was Anna collapsing against the doorframe. And then the Wartburg turned a corner, and the apartment building was gone. The Ministry for State Security headquarters on Norman Instrasse was a complex of buildings that occupied an entire city block. Petra had passed it before on the tram, had seen the barriers and guards and the blank windows that never seemed to have anyone behind them. She'd heard the rumors every East German heard, that people went in and didn't come out, or came out different, broken in ways that didn't show. They took her through an underground entrance, past checkpoints where guards verified paperwork without speaking, down corridors painted institutional green that smelled of disinfectant and old cigarettes. The fluorescent lights hummed. Their footsteps echoed on linoleum floors. No one spoke to her. They put her in a room on the 3rd floor. It was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, with concrete walls painted white. A table, 2 chairs. A single light fixture in the ceiling with no cover, just a bare bulb. No windows, no clock. Nothing to mark the passage of time except the beating of her own heart. One of the officers pointed to a chair. "Sit." She sat. "Someone will come to speak with you shortly. Do not move from that chair. Do not touch anything. Do not speak unless spoken to." Then they left, and she heard the lock turn in the door. Petra sat in the chair and tried not to panic. Time moved strangely in the white room. Without a window or clock, without any external reference, minutes and hours became indistinguishable. She counted her breaths to stay oriented. She tried to remember everything she'd heard on the radio about resistance, about political prisoners, about people who'd survived interrogations by the Stasi. She remembered Klaus Bauer saying once, "In a broadcast about human rights, the interrogation is designed to isolate you, to make you doubt yourself, to convince you that cooperation is your only option. But remember, silence is also an answer. Dignity is always a choice." She clung to that thought like a rope in the darkness. After what might have been 2 hours or 6, the door opened. A woman entered. She was in her mid-30s, professionally dressed, with short dark hair and glasses. She carried a folder thick with documents. She sat down across from Petra, opened the folder, and studied it for a long moment before speaking. When she did speak, her voice was calm, almost friendly. "My name is Officer Richter. I'm going to ask you some questions, and you're going to answer them honestly. If you cooperate, this will be brief and painless. If you don't cooperate, it will take much longer, and the consequences will be significantly worse. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Good." Richter removed a document from the folder and slid it across the table. It was a transcript, Petra realized. A transcript of one of her recorded tapes, typed neatly with timestamps and speaker identifications. "Do you recognize this?" Petra's throat was dry. "Yes." "Did you record this broadcast from Rias, Berlin, on the night of March 28, 1983, in your apartment at Schanhauser Allee 47? "Yes." "Did anyone else know you were recording these broadcasts?" This was the first trap. If she said yes and named her mother, Anna would be arrested. If she said no, they might believe her, or they might assume she was lying and arrest Anna anyway. No one else knew, Petra said. Richter made a note. "Your mother claims she discovered your radioactivity approximately 3 weeks ago. She states that she ordered you to stop and believed you had complied. Is this true?" So Anna had already been questioned. Probably while Petra was sitting in this room, her mother was sitting in another identical room somewhere in this building, being asked similar questions designed to trap them both in contradictions. "Yes," Petra said. "She told me to stop. I pretended to stop, but I continued listening secretly." "Why?" The question hung in the air. It was the question behind all questions, the one that mattered. Why would you risk everything for voices on a radio? Why would you choose danger over safety? Why would you refuse the comfortable lies that everyone else accepted? Petra looked at Officer Richter and decided to tell the truth. "Because I wanted to hear people think," she said. "I wanted to hear conversations where people could disagree without being punished. I wanted to know what it felt like when words meant what they said, instead of meaning whatever the party decided they meant." Richter's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of something that might have been recognition or might have been contempt. You wanted freedom, Richter said. I wanted to think. Thinking, Richter said slowly, is not prohibited in the German Democratic Republic. What's prohibited is allowing hostile foreign powers to manipulate your thinking. RIA's Berlin is a propaganda tool of American imperialism designed to undermine socialist society. Every broadcast is calculated to create doubt, division, and disloyalty. You weren't hearing people think, you were being programmed. They argued with each other, Petra said. If it was propaganda, wouldn't they all say the same thing? Sophisticated propaganda appears diverse. It gives the illusion of free thought while actually serving a unified agenda, the destruction of socialism. Petra said nothing. There was no point in arguing. The conversation wasn't about truth. It was about establishing her guilt and determining how to use it. Richter removed another document from the folder. We've been watching you for 3 months, Petra, since your teacher, Frau Kohler, first reported your concerning questions in class. We've documented 17 separate instances of suspicious behavior, unusual fatigue, distraction, ideological inconsistency in your essays, evasive responses during study group. We've interviewed your classmates, your neighbors, your mother's co-workers. We've built a comprehensive file on your activities and associations. She spread several photographs across the table. Petra recognized herself in each one, leaving her apartment building, walking to school, standing in line at the bakery. The photos were grainy, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, but they were unmistakably her. We could have arrested you weeks ago, Richter continued, but we chose to wait. We wanted to see if you would involve others. We wanted to map your network of contacts. We wanted to understand the full extent of the contamination. There is no network, Petra said. I listened alone. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't try to spread any information. You discussed Galileo in class. You questioned the curriculum. That's spreading information. I asked a question. You challenged authority using Western rhetorical frameworks. Where did you learn those frameworks? From listening to the radio. What else did you learn? And there it was, the real question. They didn't just want to punish her. They wanted to understand what ideas she'd absorbed, how those ideas might spread, how they could preemptively neutralize the contamination in others. They wanted to use her. Richter leaned forward. Petra, you're 17 years old. You're a student with a promising future. Your Jugendweihe is in 2 months. After that, you could attend university, pursue a career, build a life. But right now, you're facing serious charges. Consumption of hostile propaganda. Possession of illegal recording equipment. Ideological subversion. These charges carry sentences of 3 to 10 years in prison. Do you understand what that means? Petra understood perfectly. She'd heard the rumors about the prisons, about the isolation cells and the forced labor and the psychological techniques designed to break people into pieces. She'd heard about women who came out silent, and men who came out violent, and children who came out missing something essential that could never be recovered. I understand, she said. Good, because I'm going to offer you an alternative. Richter's voice became almost gentle, almost maternal. You made a mistake. You were curious, and curiosity is natural at your age. The party understands this. We don't want to destroy your life over a mistake. We want to help you correct course. How? By demonstrating your loyalty. By proving that you understand the error of your ways and are committed to the socialist project. Richter removed a final document from her folder and placed it in front of Petra. You'll sign a confession acknowledging your illegal activities. You'll provide a detailed account of everything you heard on RIA's Berlin and how it affected your thinking. And then you'll assist us. Assist you how? By identifying other potential security risks. Your classmates, for instance. Who else has expressed doubts? Who else asks suspicious questions? Who else might be consuming Western media? Richter's smile was thin. You'll become an inoffizieller Mitarbeiter, an unofficial collaborator. You'll attend school, participate in study groups, live your normal life, but you'll also watch, listen, and report. You'll help us identify problems before they metastasize. You'll protect the Republic. The room seemed to contract. Petra looked at the document in front of her, at the blank lines waiting for her signature, and understood that this was the real punishment. Not prison, not isolation, but this, becoming part of the machine that had crushed her. They wanted to turn her into Frau Kohler, into Thomas Becker, into one of the 200,000 informants who kept East Germany functioning by watching each other, reporting each other, destroying each other one small betrayal at a time. And if I refuse? Petra asked. Richter's expression hardened. Then you'll be tried, convicted, and sentenced. Your mother, as a co-conspirator who failed to report your activities, will likely face charges as well. You'll both go to prison. Your names will be removed from public records. It will be as if you never existed. My mother didn't know. Your mother lives in a 3-room apartment with you. She shares your bedroom. She's your legal guardian. The notion that she didn't know is absurd, and no court will believe it. Richter tapped the confession form. This is your chance to protect her. Sign this, cooperate with us, and your mother stays free. Refuse, and you condemn her along with yourself. It was elegant, Petra thought distantly. The perfect trap. They'd spent 3 months building it, documenting her activities, interviewing witnesses, constructing a case that could destroy both her and her mother. And now they were offering her the same choice people faced every day in East Germany. Betray others to save yourself, or maintain your integrity and lose everything. She thought about her mother standing in the doorway in her nightgown, watching her daughter being taken away. She thought about the people on the radio, the ones who argued and questioned and disagreed without fear. She thought about Galileo, insisting on truth even when truth was punished. And she thought about Klaus Bauer's voice saying, "Dignity is always a choice." Petra looked at Officer Richter and said, "No." The words seemed to echo in the white room. Richter blinked. "Excuse me?" "No. I won't sign. I won't inform. Do whatever you're going to do to me, but I won't become what you are." For the first time, Richter's professional mask slipped. Her face flushed with anger. "You stupid girl. Do you think this is about principles? Do you think you're being brave? You're 17. You know nothing about the world. You listen to a radio for 3 months and think you understand freedom. But freedom without discipline is chaos. Freedom without structure is anarchy. We protect you from that chaos. We give you order, safety, purpose. And you spit on it because you heard some smooth-talking capitalist on a radio. Maybe, Petra said. But at least I heard him. At least I got to decide what I believed instead of having it decided for me. Richter stood abruptly, gathering her documents. You'll have time to reconsider. Days, weeks, months, if necessary. We're very patient, and we're very good at helping people see reason. She left, locking the door behind her. Petra sat alone in the white room and waited. They kept her for 16 days. She never saw a trial. She never spoke to a lawyer. She existed in a legal void where normal rules didn't apply, where the state could hold her indefinitely under the elastic category of security investigation. The interrogations followed a pattern. Officer Richter would arrive, sometimes after an hour, sometimes after 10. Always asking the same questions in slightly different forms. Who else knew about the radio? What specific broadcasts had she heard? What information had she shared with classmates? Would she reconsider signing the cooperation agreement? Petra answered the factual questions honestly. She confirmed what they already knew. Yes, she'd listened. Yes, she'd recorded. Yes, she'd kept it secret. But she refused to speculate about other people. She refused to interpret her classmates' casual comments as signs of disloyalty. She refused to become a spy. After each interrogation, she was returned to the white room. They controlled everything: light, sound, time, temperature. Sometimes the room was freezing, sometimes stifling. Sometimes they left the lights on for what felt like days. Sometimes they cut the lights entirely, and she sat in absolute darkness, losing track of where she ended and the void began. They brought food at irregular intervals, sometimes a bowl of thin soup and a piece of bread, sometimes nothing for stretches that left her dizzy with hunger. There was a bucket in the corner that served as a toilet. No privacy, no dignity. Just the slow erosion of self that came from being reduced to a body with basic needs and no autonomy. But they didn't beat her. They didn't torture her physically. The GDR had learned from earlier decades that visible scars created martyrs. Invisible scars were more efficient. On the 10th day, they brought her mother. Anna looked 20 years older. Her skin was gray, her eyes hollow. She sat across the table from Petra in a different interrogation room, while Officer Richter observed from the corner. "Petra," Anna whispered, "please, just sign whatever they want." "I can't," her voice broke. "I can't lose you too." "Frau Mannheim has been very cooperative," Richter said. "She's provided detailed statements about your father's defection, about the atmosphere in your home, about her attempts to correct your behavior. She understands the seriousness of the situation. She wants to help you. Why won't you let her help you?" Petra looked at her mother and saw everything she'd spent 4 years trying to avoid. Anna broken, Anna desperate, Anna willing to say anything to survive. And beneath that she saw something else, a plea. Not give them what they want, but forgive me for what I've already given them. "I love you, Mama," Petra said, "but I can't do what they want. I'm sorry." Anna's face crumpled. A guard led her from the room. It was the last time Petra saw her mother for 3 years. On the 16th day, Officer Richter arrived with different documents. "You're being transferred," she said without preamble. "The state has concluded that you represent an ongoing security risk despite your youth. You'll be tried in closed court and sentenced to a term of corrective education at a youth facility. Your mother, having cooperated with the investigation and demonstrated genuine remorse for her oversight, will receive a suspended sentence and mandatory participation in ideological re-education programs." Petra felt relief flood through her so intensely it was almost painful. Anna was safe. Whatever happened next, at least Anna was safe. "How long?" she asked. 3 years. "You'll be released at age 20, assuming you demonstrate appropriate ideological progress. 3 years. It could have been worse. It could have been 10. It could have been the rest of her life." "There's one more thing," Richter said. She looked at Petra with an expression that might have been respect or might have been disgust. "Before you're transferred, you're permitted one final statement for the record. Most prisoners use it to express remorse, but I suspect you'll do something different." She placed a recording device on the table and pressed a button. A red light began blinking. "This is Stasi, file 347/83. Subject Petra Mannheim. Final statement before sentencing. You may begin." Petra stared at the machine, at the small microphone that would capture her voice and seal it in a file that would follow her forever. She thought about all the tapes she'd recorded in her apartment, all the voices she'd tried to preserve because they said things that mattered. Now she had a chance to say something that mattered. "My name is Petra Mannheim," she began. "I'm 17 years old. I live in East Berlin. And for 3 months, I listened to a radio station that told me things my government doesn't want me to know." Richter's eyes narrowed, but she didn't stop the recording. "I listened because I wanted to think. Because I wanted to hear people disagree without being punished for it. Because I wanted to know what freedom sounded like, even if I couldn't have it myself." Petra's voice grew stronger. "The state says I was being manipulated by enemy propaganda. Maybe that's true. Or maybe I was just hearing the truth for the first time. And the state calls that manipulation because truth is dangerous to people who rule through lies." "That's enough," Richter said. But Petra kept talking. "I know this recording will be buried. I know no one outside this building will ever hear it. But I'm making it anyway because someday, maybe in 10 years, maybe in 50, someone will open these files. Someone will read the transcripts and listen to the tapes, and I want that person to know that we existed, that some of us refused, that some of us chose truth over safety, even when truth meant prison." Richter reached for the recorder. "My father left because he couldn't breathe here," Petra said quickly. "I stayed and learned why. And I won't apologize for learning. I won't apologize for listening. I won't apologize for being a person instead of a machine. Richter shut off the recorder and removed the tape. That statement will be classified as evidence of persistent hostile attitudes and will contribute to your file. You've just made your situation worse. I know, Petra said, but at least I said it. They transferred her that afternoon to a facility outside Dresden called the Jugendwerkhof Torgau, a youth workshop that was actually a prison for teenagers deemed ideologically unreliable. She traveled in the back of a windowless van, handcuffed to a metal bar, her few possessions in a cloth bag at her feet. The facility was a converted reformatory from the 19th century. All stone walls and iron bars and corridors that smelled of mold and institutional food. They processed her efficiently, confiscated her clothes, gave her a uniform, assigned her a number, photographed her from 3 angles for the file. She shared a cell with 2 other girls. One was 16, arrested for trying to escape to West Germany. The other was 18, arrested for distributing underground samizdat literature. They taught Petra the rules. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't make eye contact with the guards. Don't trust anyone who seems friendly, because half the inmates were informants. The days were structured around labor and re-education. 6 hours of factory work assembling electronic components for export. 2 hours of ideological instruction where a party educator explained why they were there and what they needed to do to prove their rehabilitation. 2 hours of self-criticism sessions where they were expected to confess their failures and denounce each other's lingering errors. It was brutal, not because it was violent, but because it was boring. They were trying to grind her down with monotony, to make her so desperate for stimulation that cooperation would seem like relief. But Petra had learned something during her 3 months with the radio. That the mind could be free even when the body was caged. She couldn't listen to Ria's Berlin anymore, couldn't hear Klaus Bauer's voice or the callers who argued about ideas. But she could remember. She could replay the conversations in her mind, parse the arguments, imagine what they might say about her situation. She had debates with herself in the silence of her cell. She questioned. She doubted. She thought. And thinking, she discovered, was the one thing they couldn't take from her. 3 years is a long time when you're 17. Petra turned 18 in prison, 1920. She watched the seasons change through a barred window. Watched new prisoners arrive and old prisoners leave. Watched the Berlin Wall continue to stand because walls always seemed permanent until the moment they fell. She learned to survive. She learned which guards could be reasoned with and which were dangerous. She learned how to hide her thoughts behind a mask of compliance, how to say the words they wanted without meaning them, how to perform rehabilitation while keeping her core self intact. She made friends, carefully and cautiously. The girl who'd tried to escape, her name was Sophie, became something like a sister. They whispered at night when the guards weren't listening, sharing stories about the world outside, keeping each other's hope alive. After we get out, Sophie would say, "We'll do something that matters. We'll tell people what it was like here. We'll make sure no one forgets." "How?" Petra would ask. "They control everything, not forever," Sophie said. "Nothing lasts forever." Petra wanted to believe her. But every year, the wall stood solid. Every year, the system seemed as unbreakable as it had been the year before. In December 1985, during her 3rd year of incarceration, something changed. A new prisoner arrived, a boy named Andreas, 19 years old, arrested for organizing a peace demonstration in Leipzig. He was different from the other inmates, not broken yet, not resigned. He still believed things could change. Gorbachev, he told them during a forbidden conversation in the factory workroom. Mikhail Gorbachev is the new Soviet leader, and he's talking about glasnost, openness, perestroika, restructuring. He says the system needs to reform. If the Soviets are reforming, the GDR can't stay frozen forever. The GDR will stay frozen until it collapses, one of the older prisoners said bitterly. Honecker will never reform. He'll keep the wall standing until we're all dead. But Andreas was insistent. Things are changing. You can feel it. Maybe not today, maybe not next year, but soon. Petra wanted to believe him, but belief, she'd learned, was dangerous. It made time move slower. It made disappointment sharper. She focused instead on survival, on getting through each day, on protecting the small spark of self that the system was trying to extinguish. And then, on April 12, 1986, a guard called her name during the morning assembly, Mannheim. "You're being released early. Gather your belongings." Petra stood frozen, certain she'd misheard. "Move!" the guard barked. She moved. They processed her release with the same efficiency they'd processed her imprisonment. Returned her clothes, now too large because she'd lost weight in 3 years. Returned her possessions. The cloth bag was empty except for a photograph of her mother she'd been allowed to keep. Gave her a train ticket to Berlin and a piece of paper stating that she'd completed her corrective education and was now a rehabilitated citizen of the German Democratic Republic. They didn't apologize. They didn't explain the early release. They simply opened the gates and let her walk out. Outside, the world looked different, or perhaps she looked different. Everything seemed sharper, louder, more real than she remembered. The sky was too big. The streets were too open. After 3 years in a cell, freedom felt terrifying. She took the train to Berlin. It was a 4-hour journey, and she spent it staring out the window at the landscape rolling past, fields, forests, small towns with their careful conformity. East Germany looked exactly as it had when she left. But she knew somehow that it wasn't the same. Andreas had been right. Something was shifting beneath the surface, invisible but inevitable. When she arrived at Ostbahnhof, it was late afternoon. She took the tram to Prenzlauer Berg, to the apartment building on Schanhauser Allee, and climbed the stairs to the 4th floor. She knocked on the door of apartment 47. Her mother answered. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Anna had aged more than 3 years. Her hair was streaked with gray. Her face was lined with stress and sleeplessness. But her eyes, when she saw Petra standing in the hallway, her eyes came alive. "Petra," she whispered. Then louder, "Petra." They embraced in the doorway, holding each other with the desperate strength of people who'd spent years believing this moment might never come. Inside the apartment, nothing had changed. The same wobbling table in the kitchen. The same brown sofa in the living room. The same curtain dividing the bedroom. Anna made tea with trembling hands while Petra sat at the table and tried to remember how to be a person instead of a prisoner. "They released you early," Anna said. "Why?" "I don't know." "They didn't say, did you?" Anna stopped, choosing her words carefully. "Did you sign anything? Agree to anything?" "No." Relief flooded Anna's face. "Good. That's good." They sat in silence for a while, drinking tea, adjusting to each other's presence. Finally, Anna said, "Your friend visited me. Sophie's mother. She told me Sophie's getting released next month. She wanted you to know." Petra felt something warm spread through her chest. Sophie had survived. They'd both survived. "I should write to her," Petra said. "Be careful what you write. They still watch everything." "I know, Mama." Another silence. Then Anna stood, went to the bedroom, and returned with something wrapped in newspaper. She placed it on the table in front of Petra. Petra unwrapped it slowly. It was the radio. The small transistor radio that had started everything. Anna had kept it, hidden, for 3 years. "I thought," Petra's voice caught. "I thought they would have destroyed it." "They took the one they found," Anna said quietly. "But your father left too. I'd hidden the other one years ago, just in case. After they arrested you, I kept it. I thought maybe when you came home you might want to listen again." Petra stared at the radio, at this small device that had cost her 3 years of her life. She should have hated it. She should have wanted to smash it against the wall. But instead she felt a fierce, protective love for this fragile piece of technology that represented the only real freedom she'd ever known. "Do you?" Anna asked. "Want to listen again?" Petra looked at her mother, at this woman who'd lied to protect her. who'd endured interrogation and suspicion and 3 years of her daughter's absence, who'd kept this radio hidden like a promise that someday things might be different. "Yes," Petra said. "Yes, I do." That night, after Anna went to sleep, Petra retrieved the radio from its hiding place. She draped the antenna wire along the window frame, exactly as her father had shown her a lifetime ago. She turned the dial slowly through the static until she found the familiar frequency. "This is Ria's Berlin. It's midnight, and you're listening to Open Lines." Klaus Bauer's voice filled the small bedroom, warm and familiar and unbearably precious. "Tonight we're discussing a topic that many of you have written about: hope. What does it mean to hope when circumstances seem hopeless? How do we maintain dignity when systems try to crush it? How do we keep believing in change when change seems impossible?" Petra pressed the radio against her ear and listened, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt like herself again. Not the girl who'd been arrested, not the prisoner who'd been broken and rebuilt, but the person underneath, the one who still wanted to think, who still wanted to question, who still believed that truth mattered even when truth was dangerous. The voices on the radio talked about freedom and resistance and the slow, invisible work of maintaining your humanity in systems designed to destroy it. They talked about political prisoners being released across Eastern Europe, about reform movements, about the possibility, however distant, that the Cold War might someday end. Petra listened until dawn, and when she finally turned off the radio, she understood something she hadn't understood at 17. The radio hadn't destroyed her life. It had saved it. Because for 3 years in prison, while her body was caged and her actions were controlled, her mind had remained free. She'd replayed those conversations in the silence of her cell. She'd questioned and argued and thought. She'd maintained the part of herself that the state couldn't reach. And that part, small and hidden and precious, was still alive. 3 years later, on November 9th, 1989, Petra Mannheim stood in a crowd at the Berlin Wall and watched it fall. She was 23 years old. She'd spent the years since her release working at a state printing press, living quietly, keeping her thoughts to herself. She'd stayed in touch with Sophie and Andreas and the other friends she'd made in prison. They met in private, spoke carefully, and waited. And then, impossibly, the moment came. The announcement was made almost accidentally, a government official misreading a memo during a press conference, saying that travel restrictions were being lifted immediately. Within hours, thousands of East Berliners had gathered at the crossing points, demanding to pass through. The guards, confused and overwhelmed and sensing that the old order was collapsing, opened the gates. Petra crossed through Checkpoint Charlie at midnight, with Sophie beside her and Andreas somewhere in the crowd ahead. On the western side, strangers handed them champagne and flowers. People were crying and singing and dancing. Someone had brought hammers and was chipping pieces from the concrete, and others joined in, turning the wall into rubble. Petra stood watching, trying to process what she was seeing. The wall, the permanent, inevitable, eternal wall that had defined her entire life, was being destroyed by ordinary people with ordinary tools. The system that had seemed unbreakable was breaking. The future that had seemed impossible was happening. She thought about her father, who'd escaped 28 years earlier and never came back. She thought about the 3 years she'd spent in prison for listening to a radio. She thought about all the people who hadn't survived, the ones who'd been shot trying to cross, the ones who'd died in custody, the ones who'd simply given up and disappeared into the gray conformity of defeat. And she thought about the voices that had kept her alive, the ones that had told her freedom was possible, that truth mattered, that dignity was always a choice. A young woman approached her, Western, by her clothes and her ease. She was holding a microphone, and behind her, a man with a television camera was filming. "Excuse me," the woman said in German. "We're interviewing people who've just crossed. Would you be willing to share your story?" Petra looked at the microphone, at the camera, at this impossibly young journalist who'd grown up in a world where saying what you thought didn't destroy your life. "Yes," Petra said. "Yes, I'll share my story." And standing there in the rubble of the Berlin Wall, with the Cold War ending around her and history being rewritten in real time, Petra Mannheim began to speak. In 2018, 29 years after the wall fell, a researcher at the Stasi Records Archive in Berlin discovered a box of audio tapes that had been misfiled during the chaos of reunification. They were labeled with case numbers and dates from the early 1980s, the final statements of political prisoners. Before their sentencing, most had been lost or destroyed when the Stasi frantically shredded documents in 1989, trying to erase evidence of their surveillance state before it collapsed entirely. But these tapes had survived, hidden in a filing error, waiting. One tape was labeled File 347/83, subject, Mannheim P., the researcher. A young woman who'd been born after reunification loaded the tape into a player and pressed play. A voice filled the room, young, frightened, but determined. "My name is Petra Mannheim. I'm 17 years old, I live in East Berlin, and for 3 months, I listened to a radio station that told me things my government doesn't want me to know, ... Quotes, the researcher listened to the entire statement. 3 minutes and 47 seconds of a teenage girl explaining why she'd chosen truth over safety, why she'd refused to become an informant, why dignity mattered more than survival. When the tape ended, the researcher sat in silence for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and made a call. 2 months later, Petra Mannheim, now 53 years old, a translator and occasional lecturer on GDR history, received a letter from the Stasi archive. They'd found her tape. They wanted to know if she'd be willing to have it released publicly, as part of an educational program about resistance under the East German regime. Petra read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking. She'd forgotten about the tape. Or perhaps she'd assumed it had been destroyed decades ago, along with so much other evidence. She'd moved on with her life, married, divorced, raised a daughter who'd grown up in a unified Germany and couldn't quite understand what it had been like before. She'd made peace with her past, or at least learned to live with it, but now this tape was asking her to remember. She called the archive. She said yes. On a cold evening in November 2018, in a lecture hall at Humboldt University, Petra Mannheim's tape was played publicly for the first time. The audience was mostly students, young people who'd been born in the 2000s, who'd grown up with the internet and smartphones and the casual freedom to say whatever they thought. They'd studied the GDR in history classes, but it was abstract to them, as distant as medieval feudalism or ancient Rome. But when Petra's 17-year-old voice filled the hall, speaking about wanting to think, about refusing to inform, about choosing dignity, something shifted. The students leaned forward. They stopped whispering. They listened. And when the tape ended, there was silence. Then someone started clapping. Others joined. Within seconds, the entire hall was applauding, not for the speaker, but for the girl on the tape, for the courage it took to say those words knowing they would cost her everything. Petra sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face, as this room full of young people honored the choice she'd made 35 years ago. After the applause faded, the moderator invited her to speak. Petra stood slowly and walked to the podium. She looked out at the students, at their young faces full of freedom they'd never had to fight for, and tried to find the right words. "That girl on the tape," she said finally, "that was me. But it was also thousands of others who made similar choices and weren't lucky enough to survive. It was my friend Sophie who spent 4 years in prison for trying to cross the wall. It was Andreas who was beaten by police for organizing a peace demonstration. It was my mother, who kept a forbidden radio hidden for 3 years because she believed I'd come home and want to listen again." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I listened to that radio because I wanted to hear what freedom sounded like. And for 3 years in prison, I survived by remembering those voices, by replaying the conversations in my mind, by refusing to let the system tell me what to think." She looked at the students. "You've grown up in freedom. You've never known what it's like to have your thoughts policed, your words monitored, your silence weaponized. And I'm grateful for that. But I also want you to understand how fragile freedom is, how easily it can be eroded, how important it is to speak, to question, to resist, not just when it's easy, but especially when it's hard. The room was absolutely silent. The girl on that tape said dignity is always a choice, Petra continued. And it is. But it's a choice you have to make every day. Every time you encounter injustice and decide whether to speak or stay silent. Every time you see someone being mistreated and decide whether to help or walk away. Every time you're told to accept something wrong because resistance is dangerous. She smiled slightly. I made my choice at 17, and it cost me 3 years of my life. But I'd make the same choice today. Because those 3 years in prison, I was more free than I'd ever been in 17 years of obedience. Petra sat down. The students applauded again, longer this time, and several came forward afterward to ask questions, to thank her, to tell her that her story mattered. But one student, a young woman with dark hair and serious eyes, hung back until the others had left. Frau Mannheim, she said quietly, I want you to know something. What's that? My grandmother lives in Prenzlauer Berg. She told me once about a neighbor who was arrested when she was just a girl, for listening to the radio. The student's eyes were wet. I think that was you. And I think my grandmother always wondered what happened to you. Petra felt her breath catch. What's your grandmother's name? Anna Fischer. But before she remarried, it was Anna Mannheim. The world tilted. Your mother survived, the student said, and now she was crying openly. She's still alive. She's 83, and she would very much like to see you 3 days later. Petra stood outside a nursing home in Prenzlauer Berg, holding a bouquet of flowers and trying to steady her breathing. She hadn't seen her mother in 15 years. Anna had developed dementia in the early 2000s, and eventually the care had become too much. Petra had visited regularly at first, but as Anna's memory deteriorated, the visits became harder, watching her mother forget her name, her history, everything they'd survived together. Eventually, Petra had stopped going. It was cowardly, she knew, but she couldn't bear watching her mother disappear piece by piece. Now, standing outside the nursing home with her granddaughter beside her, Petra felt that old guilt resurface. She doesn't remember much, the granddaughter warned gently. But sometimes she has good days. Today might be a good day. They went inside. Anna's room was small but comfortable, with a window overlooking a garden. Anna herself was sitting in a chair by the window, thin and fragile, her white hair catching the afternoon light. She didn't look up when they entered. Oma, the granddaughter said softly. Someone's here to see you. Anna turned slowly. Her eyes were cloudy, distant, but when they focused on Petra's face, something flickered. Petra? She whispered. Yes, Mama, it's me. Anna's face crumpled. My girl, my brave, stupid girl. You came home. Petra crossed the room and knelt beside her mother's chair, taking Anna's thin hands in hers. I came home, Mama. I'm here. They sat together as the afternoon light faded, holding hands, occasionally speaking but mostly just existing in each other's presence. At one point, Anna looked at Petra with sudden clarity and said, Did you keep listening after you got out? Petra smiled through her tears. Yes, Mama, I kept listening. Good, Anna said. That's good. Your father would be proud. As the sun set, Anna's lucidity faded again. She drifted into sleep, her head resting against Petra's shoulder, her breathing slow and peaceful. The granddaughter touched Petra's arm. She'll forget this by tomorrow. She won't remember you visited. I know, Petra said, but I'll remember. And that's enough. Petra Mannheim died in 2024, at the age of 58, from cancer that had been detected too late. In her obituary, the newspapers described her as a former political prisoner, a resistance figure, and a symbol of courage under oppression. But to those who knew her best, she was simply someone who'd made a choice at 17 and lived with the consequences of that choice for the rest of her life. At her funeral, her daughter played a recording from that 1983 tape, the voice of a teenage girl saying, I won't apologize for listening. I won't apologize for being a person instead of a machine. And in a world that had mostly forgotten what the Berlin Wall looked like, that voice was a reminder. A reminder that freedom is never guaranteed. That truth is always dangerous. That dignity costs everything and is worth the price. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is turn on a radio and listen. If this story made you reflect on how fragile freedom really is, how easily it can be lost, how much courage it takes to defend, consider remembering it. There are many more Cold War stories like Petra's, stories of ordinary people who made extraordinary choices when silence would have been safer. They shouldn't be forgotten.